Welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah,
We're going to be looking at child soldiers,
right.
specifically Sudan's efforts to protect children from exploitation and recruitment by armed groups.
It's a big issue.
It is. And we're going to be using a paper as our guide for this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's called Sudan's Experience in the Legal Protection of Children from Exploitation and Recruitment
Okay.
by Dr. Badreldin Abdalla Hassan Hamad, who's a professor of public international law at the Islamic University of Medina.
Interesting.
And it was published in the World Journal of Entrepreneurship, Management, and Sustainable Development.
Wow.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah.
But
What a big words.
yeah, it really dives into, the steps that Sudan has taken to address this problem.
Yeah. And it's a complex issue.
It is complex, and, Sudan has kind of a unique perspective on this
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they've been dealing with conflict for so long.
Continuously, pretty much since 1956.
Yeah, so they've got, decades
Right.
of experience with this problem.
And they've seen how it's evolved over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I guess to start,
Yeah. Yeah.
how do we even define a child soldier?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question because there is no one universal legal definition. And in
Absolutely.
fact, the article traces the evolution of that concept.
Okay.
Going all the way back to the Geneva Conventions, which focused on preventing children under the age of 15 from being involved in combat.
So initially it was really about keeping the youngest kids off the battlefield.
That's right.
But obviously things have evolved.
And the scope has widened.
Yeah.
You've got agreements like the Cape Town Principles, which expanded the definition to include anyone under 18
Oh, wow.
and broadened the scope of what constitutes involvement with an armed group.
So it's not just carrying a gun anymore.
No,
It could be.
it could be cooking,
Yeah.
being a messenger, or even forced marriage with members of the group.
Wow, that's a much wider net.
Right.
And it really captures
Yeah.
the many ways children are exploited
exactly.
by these groups.
And these agreements, like the Cape Town Principles and the Paris Principles, have really been influential in shaping how we think about child soldiery.
It's interesting you mentioned that because
Yeah.
Sudan actually just in 2021
Okay.
passed a child bill,
Mhm.
which included a definition of a child soldier
Right.
that aligns with these broader principles.
So that's a big step forward.
Yeah, it is a big step forward. I
Yeah.
mean, it shows that they're taking these international standards seriously.
It also allows Sudan to kind of tap into that
Mhm.
international network and
Yeah.
the full force of international law to address the issue.
It makes them part of the solution instead of being
Right.
part of the problem.
Exactly.
So it does raise a question, though.
Okay.
Even if a child says they want to join an army,
Mm-hmm.
should that ever be allowed?
That's a tough one.
It's an ethical dilemma.
Right. And it really raises questions about a child's capacity
Yeah.
to give informed consent.
Especially in an environment where they might be pressured.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or coerced.
A lot of factors at play.
Definitely something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we've talked about definitions,
Mm-hmm.
but what leads to children ending up in these situations in the first place?
Well, Dr. Hamad identifies three main contributing factors in the article.
Okay.
First one being political exploitation. Children are often used as pawns by armed groups.
It's a horrible thought.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
And they're seen as expendable and easier to manipulate than adults.
So they're deliberately targeted.
Yes.
Okay. The second factor?
The social pressure, often tied to strong tribal loyalties
Okay.
or weak governance structures.
So in those situations, joining an armed group could be seen as a way to
Yeah.
gain social standing
Right. Or protect one's family.
or even just to survive.
Yeah.
Like all these forces pushing these children.
Yeah. Right. Towards these groups.
And the article also mentions easy access to weapons as a contributing factor.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It just fuels the problem.
Yeah. And then the final factor.
Is economic disparity.
Right.
When children and their families are desperate, joining an armed group
Yeah.
can seem like the only option for a better life.
Even if it means risking their safety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a terrible choice,
Yeah.
but sometimes it feels like the only one.
Right. And it really highlights
Yeah.
the need to address those root causes if we want to find lasting solutions.
It's not just about stopping recruitment.
Right.
It's about tackling the underlying issues that make it appealing in the first place?
So let's talk about what Sudan has been doing to tackle this problem.
Okay.
Dr. Hamad goes through the evolution of Sudanese law,
Right.
and it's interesting to see how it's progressed.
It starts with the police and national service laws, which predate many international protocols on child soldiers.
And interestingly enough, these laws actually set the recruitment age at 18.
Oh, wow. So they were kind of ahead of their time in a way.
In a way, yes. But it's important to note that they weren't sufficient to prevent child recruitment before 2005.
So it shows that laws on paper aren't always enough.
Exactly. You need enforcement mechanisms and a real commitment to protecting children.
Okay, so when did things start to really shift?
Well, the 2007 Armed Forces Act was a big turning point.
Okay.
It not only aligned with the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, which Sudan ratified in 2004, but it also introduced specific punishments for child recruitment and a dedicated chapter for civilian protection.
So they were getting serious.
Much more so.
Yeah.
And that chapter included specific provisions for protecting children during conflict.
So it went beyond just setting an age limit.
Right. It was about actively trying to prevent and punish child recruitment.
And that progress continued.
It did.
With the interim constitution in 2005.
Right.
The Child Act of 2010, and then ultimately the Child Bill of 2021.
That's right. Each one building on the last to strengthen protections for children.
So it seems like they've made a real effort to align their laws with those international standards.
Yes, and the Child Bill of 2021 is particularly important because it addresses gaps in previous legislation, clearly defines the roles of different agencies responsible for child protection, and aims to be more effective in enforcement.
So it's not just words on paper.
No, it's about putting those words into action and making sure that they have real consequences.
We've talked a lot about the evolution of Sudanese law, but the article also highlights the influence of international agreements.
Right.
Sudan has ratified several key conventions, including the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, and most importantly, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol.
These international agreements, especially the optional protocol, have been really important.
Are not just in providing a framework for Sudan to follow, but also in creating a sense of accountability.
I see.
And pressure.
So it's kind of like external pressure pushing them to do the right thing.
It's a great example of how international pressure can drive positive change.
So we've got the laws, we've got the international pressure, but what about action on the ground?
Right.
Tell me about the organizations working to make a difference.
Well, the article focuses on two key organizations.
Okay.
The first one is the National Council for Child Welfare, or NCCW.
What do they do?
They're the main coordinating body for all things child protection in Sudan.
So they're not just about rescuing children from armed groups.
No, they do a lot more than that.
Okay.
They raise awareness about child rights.
Okay.
They coordinate with different ministries, and they even represent Sudan at international conferences.
So they're really trying to tackle this.
Yes. They're a great example of how national efforts are linked to a global network.
And the second organization is the Sudan Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration Commission.
That's a mouthful.
It is, we'll just call it the DDR.
Okay.
The DDR focuses on helping former child soldiers transition back to civilian life.
So that's like reintegration support education.
Right. All of that.
It's a big job.
It is, but they're making a difference.
That's good to hear.
According to the article, over 2,600 children have been registered with the DDR.
Yeah.
And over 1,200 have been successfully reintegrated into their communities.
Wow, it's amazing.
And in South Darfur alone, over 250 children have been reintegrated successfully.
So they're making a tangible impact.
Yes, it's challenging work, but it's clearly having a positive impact.
It's really inspiring to hear about these organizations and the work they're doing.
It's important to remember, though, that reintegrating former child soldiers is a long and complex process.
Right. It's not just about getting them out of an armed group.
Exactly.
And that actually leads us perfectly into the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore the complexities of reintegration in more detail.
Sounds good.
Look at the challenges and successes of these efforts.
I'm looking forward to it. Before we jump into the DDR and reintegration, I think it's worth highlighting a specific aspect of the optional protocol that's been really influential in Sudan. Article 4 specifically calls on states to take all feasible measures to prevent the recruitment and use of children under 18 by armed groups.
So it's not just like a general statement?
No, it's a call to action.
It's got teeth.
Exactly.
Right.
And we see that reflected in Sudan's 2007 Armed Forces Act,
Right.
which criminalizes child recruitment and establishes penalties for violators.
Okay, so that's where those enforcement mechanisms come in.
That's right. Laws are only effective
Yeah.
if there are consequences for breaking them.
Makes sense. All right, so back to those organizations.
Okay.
Doing that really tough work on the ground.
Yeah.
We were talking about the DDR and the challenges of reintegrating former child soldiers.
Right. And it's important to understand that this is a really complex process.
What are some of the biggest challenges that they face?
Well, one of the most significant is the trauma
Right.
that these children have experienced.
They've seen things.
They've seen things, they've been forced to do things that no child should ever have to endure.
So how do you even begin to address that?
Well, providing access to quality mental health care is crucial.
So it's not just about
No.
providing food and shelter.
It's about healing those deep emotional scars.
Are there any specific stories in the article that kind of illustrate this?
Yeah, Dr. Hamad mentions the case of a young boy named Omar,
Okay.
who was abducted at age 12
Oh, wow.
and forced to fight for 3 years.
And what happened to him?
Well, when he was finally released, he was deeply traumatized.
Understandably.
Struggled to adjust to life back home,
Yeah.
but through the DDR's reintegration program,
Okay.
he received counseling, he was reunited with his family, and enrolled in vocational training.
Wow. So
Yeah.
he's getting back on his feet.
He's now working as a carpenter.
That's incredible.
It really shows the resilience of the human spirit.
It does, but I imagine there are also cases where reintegration is
Oh, absolutely.
more difficult.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors that can make it more challenging.
Like what?
Well, one major obstacle is the stigma that former child soldiers often face in their communities.
Yeah.
They may be seen as a threat,
Right.
ostracized, or even rejected by their families.
So they come home and they're still not accepted.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. So how do they address that?
The DDR does a lot of community outreach and sensitization programs to raise awareness about the needs of former child soldiers and to combat that stigma.
So it's about changing hearts and minds.
Exactly. It's a long process, but it's
Yeah.
essential for creating an environment where these children can truly heal and thrive.
The article also mentions the importance of education and vocational training.
Absolutely.
Why are those elements so crucial?
Well, many child soldiers have missed out on years of schooling, so it's hard for them to catch up and reintegrate into the formal education system.
So vocational training gives them
Yeah, it gives them practical skills that can help them find employment.
become self-sufficient.
Exactly, and it gives them a sense of purpose and hope for the future.
So it's about more than just learning a trade.
It's about rebuilding their lives.
And the DDR offers a variety of those programs.
They do. They try to tailor the programs to the individual interests
Oh, that's great.
and aptitudes of the children.
So they might learn carpentry tailoring mechanics?
Exactly. Or computer programming.
Wow. It seems like they're really taking a holistic approach.
They are. They're trying to address the psychological, social, and economic needs of these children.
But I'm guessing it's not always easy.
Oh, of course not.
Are there setbacks or challenges they encounter?
Yes. One of the biggest challenges is ensuring the long-term sustainability of these programs.
Okay.
Reintegration is not a quick fix.
Right.
It requires ongoing commitment and funding.
Yeah. And I imagine funding is,
Funding is always a challenge.
especially in a country like Sudan that's facing
Exactly.
so many other issues.
And there are other challenges, too.
Okay.
Some children may struggle to adjust to civilian life.
And be tempted to go back.
Yes. Especially if they face poverty, discrimination, or lack of opportunities.
So preventing recidivism is a major focus of the DDR's work.
Yeah. It really highlights the need to address those
Absolutely.
causes.
We can't just focus on getting children out of armed groups.
Right.
We have to create a society where they don't feel like they need to join them in the first place.
And that's where the international community comes in.
Exactly. Sudan can't do this alone.
Right.
International partnerships and support are essential.
Well, that brings us to the next stage of our deep dive.
We're going to shift our focus to those global efforts to combat child soldiering.
Sounds good.
Look at the challenges that remain and what more can be done to protect children caught in the crossfire.
I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've been talking about Sudan's efforts to address this issue of child soldiers. But as we've kind of hinted at, this isn't just a problem in Sudan.
It's a global issue.
Yeah, it's a global crisis.
Absolutely.
So how widespread is this problem, really?
Well, according to the UN, Tens of thousands of children are currently being used in armed conflicts around the world.
Tens of thousands?
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine that many kids.
It's a staggering number.
Where are we seeing this happening?
It's a long list, unfortunately.
Yeah.
You see it in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And are the factors driving recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, they're often very similar to what we talked about in Sudan.
So poverty, weak governance, political instability.
All of those things contribute.
So what's being done on an international level?
Well, fortunately, there are a number of international organizations working to prevent child recruitment.
Like who?
Well, the UN plays a major role with agencies like UNICEF and the Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict.
So what are they doing on the ground?
They're doing a lot of different things. They're monitoring and reporting on violations against children. They're advocating for stronger legal frameworks.
Okay, so kind of like what we saw with the optional protocol.
Exactly. They're also providing direct support to child soldiers and their families.
And do they ever work with the armed groups themselves?
They do sometimes. They collaborate with governments and even armed groups to demobilize children and help them reintegrate into society.
That must be incredibly difficult.
It is. It requires a lot of diplomacy and a deep understanding of the local context.
But even if they can just get a few kids out.
Yeah, any child that they can help is a victory.
So all this talk about international organizations and global efforts, it's hard to know what we as individuals can do.
Right. It can feel overwhelming.
So what can we do to make a difference?
Well, first of all, I think staying informed is key. Read articles, watch documentaries, follow organizations working on this issue.
Educate ourselves, basically.
Right. And then talk about it.
Yeah, spread the word.
Exactly.
Anything else we can do?
Yeah. Supporting organizations that are dedicated to this work is huge.
Yeah.
Even a small donation can make a big difference.
Right.
You could also volunteer your time.
And we can always contact our elected officials, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Citizen advocacy can be very powerful.
Yeah.
Encourage them to prioritize child protection in their policies.
It sounds like ending the use of child soldiers really requires a collective effort.
It's not something that any one person or organization can do alone.
Well, Dr. Hamad's research has given us
a lot to think about.
It really highlights the complexities of this issue.
It does. And while progress is being made, it's clear that the fight's not over.
The journey is far from over.
Every child deserves to have a safe and peaceful childhood.
That's what we're all working towards.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. What will you do to be a part of the solution?